Some years he's over 6'1", some years he's under 6'1", and depending on what he weighs, he can weigh 230 or 240. And so what happens if this next year they decide you're under 6'1"? Chris would literally be disqualified. Coach Greg, and in today's video, Chris Bumstead, he might be disqualified from the Olympia. And no, it's not clickbait. And so I was watching Nick Trilogy, Bodybuilding and BS, a channel that talks all about bodybuilding. And so Chris came clean during an interview with Ron Harris for Muscular Development, of which he spoke of his height. And in case you're not aware, in classic physique, you're only given a certain amount of weight depending on your height. And so if you're 6'1" or under, you can only weigh up to 230 pounds. If you're over 6'1", you can weigh 240. When Chris first competed in classic physique, and I remember having this discussion with him, he heighted in under 6'1", 6 foot and 7/8, just barely under the limit, and so he could only weigh a maximum of 230 pounds. However, back then, Chris never had as much muscle, and so that weight cap, 230, it made no difference. But later, he seemed to be getting taller. And remember, Chris is in his 20s. Not very likely that he's going to grow taller. And at this point, he's now 6'1.5", almost 3/4 of an inch taller than he was when he first started competing. And what is the difference? Well, the difference is he's allowed to weigh up to 240. And his last several Olympias, he's weighed 232, 235, and 237 pounds. And so what happens if he goes to the Olympia and that same judge who's judging Chris heights him in and says, Chris, you're 6 foot and 7/8 tall. You're not over 6'1". And even if he is 6'1", that's still not enough. You need to be over 6'1". He would literally be disqualified. Why? Because he's over 230. You think he could drop 7 pounds in an hour or two to make 230? Of course not.
So you guys ever curious about how Chris Bumstead grew 1.5 inches and gained an extra 20 pounds of stage weight for the Mr. Olympia contest?
And so Nick is saying that Chris grew 1.5 inches, but from my understandings, it's only 3/4 of an inch, which is still a huge difference, but it's not 1.5 inches. I don't ever remember Chris heighting in under 6 feet tall. And remember, I have spoken to Chris about this in the past. When Chris was a bodybuilder as an amateur, I actually told him, you should switch to classic. This is the perfect division for you. But he wanted to bodybuild. He said once he turns bodybuilding, he can then switch to classic, of which he did. And obviously, that was a smart decision.
1 year, I was like, someone heighted me in at 6 foot and 7/8. And then 1 year. But the year before that and 2 years after, I was 6'1.5" about.
And so there you have it. Some years he's over 6'1", some years he's under 6'1". And depending on what he weighs, he can weigh 230 or 240. And so what happens if this next year they decide you're under 6'1"? Chris would literally be disqualified. And does that make sense? And if you think this can't happen, I've consistently heighted in for classic physique at 5'6.25", 5'6 1/8. But 1 year in Germany, I heighted in at 5'5 3/4. I said, whoa. I'm not going home. I flew all this way, dieted to compete. I've consistently been over 5'6" my entire life. I said, let me height in again. And so they graciously said, okay, try it again. And I stood a little bit straighter this time. And then I was 5'6 1/8. And so imagine if Chris were to height in and the judge said, sorry, Chris, you're not over 6'1". Chris would say, yeah, but last year I was 6'1.5", year before 6'1.5". Yeah, but Chris, you shrunk this year. But Chris, those judges, they were being lenient. They had that height-in device at the top of your hair. I'm pushing it down on your hair. And so you're half inch shorter than you think. It literally happens all the time. I height in competitors at competitions. And so let's say I were to height in the Mr. Olympia competitors, and Chris comes up and he's 6 foot and 1/2 inch tall. He says, Greg, I was 6'1.5" last year. But like, yeah, but Chris, you're 6'1.5 inches. You're clearly under the limit. What am I supposed to do? Oh, you're my friend. I know you, so you get a pass. I'm going to write whatever height you want. And if you think that doesn't happen, guess again. Horace M. Diaz, they described in this video when he heighted in short, he thought, no, he didn't. He knew exactly how tall he was. He thought the officials would let it slide. Just add in an extra inch or just write my weight being less. And so people quite literally cheat. And it's not just in bodybuilding. Have you ever seen Daniel Cormier get weighed in the UFC? He's over the weight class. Oh, I know. Put a towel over front of me and I'll push down on the towel and then I'll weigh less. He's a UFC Hall of Fame athlete, which they proved cheated to make the weight class. And so if Chris Bumstead were to show up and be under 6'1", do you think in your right mind they would say, sorry, Chris, you gots to go, you're booted out of the Olympia? There's no way. There's no way they want the best athlete in the Mr. Olympia to not compete. And so what is the solution? Does it not make sense that once you turn pro, they give you your official height? You show up to the weigh-ins and you're like, hey, Chris, you're 6'1.5". Why? Because the head judge decided so. A doctor's measured you in. We know your height. It's not going to change from year to year. And even if it does, so what? Because imagine this, Chris is 6'1.5". That's a ½ inch extra. That's a lot to work with. What if you're exactly 6'1", 0.0? If you're exactly 6 foot, you need to weigh 230 or under. If you're 6 foot and an eighth, a millimeter over, you get 10 extra pounds. 1 millimeter in height, you get 10 extra pounds. And in case you didn't know, you are literally taller in the morning than you are at night. When you lay down, go to sleep, relax, your spine literally stretches out 1/4 to even a ½ of an inch. And so if you wake up first thing in the morning and you get heighted in, first couple minutes after you wake up, you're going to be taller. But what if you register at night? You can no longer compete in your weight class. You diet for 3-4 months, travel the globe, and you're disqualified because your height is too short. And so myself and editor Steve, we did a statistical analysis of the heights and set them up with the exact height to weight ratio that they should have for classic physique. And we did so at every ½ of an inch. Does it not make more sense that if you're a ½ inch taller than someone else, you should be allowed to weigh a little bit more? Why is it 1 millimeter, suddenly 10 more pounds? Does that seem fair? And so this was before I had any followers, but we did all this work, presented the information, they never went with it. And so rather than going with ours based on research, they went with arbitrary heights and weights that make no sense. If you actually look at the data, the current height and weights, they're ridiculous. They don't make sense. And so imagine Chris was showing up to the Olympia smaller, lighter, because he was scared that they would height him in at the wrong height. Well, what if I show up and I'm 6 foot and 7/8 again? I'll be disqualified. I can't add on those muscles. But now after being over 6'1" a few times in a row, he's now comfortable, confident, relaxed, and so it's allowed him to add on that extra muscle that he deserves.
Finally, after 3 times or whatever, I looked at them. I'm like, look, I'm 6'1.5" right now. I was last year. Can you just tell me I'm going to be next year? And they're like, it depends what you head in next year.
If it happened today, Chris would not be allowed to compete. And so does this make sense? Should changes not be made?
The last thing you want to be worried about is what your height's going to be at the show. And if some guy or girl is going to screw up your height at the show, and for some reason you're 1.5 inches shorter.
And so I'm telling you from experience, and I've done this every single year, there's people competing, they're over their height, disqualified. Luckily, it's at the amateur level. They can then move into bodybuilding, or they're in a different category. But they'll often say, hey, I'm 5'7" and I height them in. They're 1 inch, 2 inches taller, shorter than they say they are.
That's a lot of height that he lost that year, that he came in a lot shorter. And it's a lot of weight. 18 to 20 pounds is a lot of stage weight, guys. And
it's not 18 pounds, 1 inch, but it's literally between 5 and 12 pounds. And if you show up at the weigh-in and you're 5 to 12 pounds over, you're not losing that weight in an hour or two. Well, some can. It's rare. Some people who are holding a lot of water, perhaps they can jog it off in a couple hours. But for the most part, it's not happening. And if it does, probably because the judges said, we'll just let you in. Don't tell anyone.
I was really 231, 230 in 2019. And then in 2020, I was 234, 235-ish. And then last year, I was 237.
And so Chris last year weighed in 3 pounds under his weight cap. And you might be thinking, well, he can only gain 3 pounds. This is actually not true. He could quite literally starve himself, deplete himself of water the day they height in, weigh in at 240, and then drink and eat after and compete 242, 245. And so if Chris really wanted to push the envelope, he could easily gain 5, 6, 7 pounds more muscle if he really wanted to.
I don't know what his weight is right now, but I've been paying very close attention to all his content he's been putting out. It doesn't look that big to me right now.
And so here's the thing. Chris might not look as big right now, 14 weeks out, but it's all dependent on how lean you are. If you're in better condition, you're obviously going to look smaller, as well as what PDs are you currently on. If he's on very low doses or perhaps none at all and decides to go on after, imagine the muscle he can put on in 14 weeks. And so just because somebody is huge, massive, 3-4 months out from a show, doesn't mean they're going to look bigger than if they were smaller heading into a show.
And Chris better not slip or someone else will take that title from him. Very easily take that title from him.
No, not very easily. Potentially, possibly, maybe 1 in 100 chance. Chris is way ahead of his competition. It's not like he barely scrapes by. It's not like he wins with split decisions. He had a perfect score. When you're winning with a perfect score, it means every single judge has you in first place. Bodybuilding is not golf. The best athlete is going to win. In golf, it could be a fluke. You have an off day, you don't shoot so well, there's 50 other competitors that are knocking at your heels. There is no competitor that if they're on point 100%, they're beating Chris. Chris at 90% is still winning the show, and so I don't believe it's going to be close. I still think Chris is going to dominate the show.
You have guys now that are using inversion tables, trying to get taller. We saw what happened with Horse MD. He thought he was going to be taller than he normally was, ended up being like 7 or 8 pounds over.
And so with the Horse MD thing, that was literally a scandal. Someone had a camera videotaping them, showing they were trying to cheat. Promoter wanted him in the show. He's famous, has lots of followers and so on. And so they desperately wanted him to be able to compete. But the other coaches were like, I'm going to film this. I'm going to make sure that you don't cheat and make my athlete come in second. And so it wasn't some problem with the inversion table not allowing him to stretch. This was people deliberately trying to cheat.
I do think it would be smart if they at least gave you like a card or wrote it down somewhere where it was like your stat, this is how tall you are, and like that's what you know. So you don't have to worry if it changes next year.
Exactly.
Is your line already out? I know
Ron.
Is your C-Bum line already out?
Yeah, we launched it last October, just before the Olympia.
I'm 100% on board with Nick Trilogy here. Ron is literally saying, so is the C-Bum line out yet? Like, when does that come out? Chris, like, well, it's been out for a year. It would be equivalent to Ron Harris interviewing Coach Greg and saying, when does the cookbook come out? Really, when does my cookbook come out? You also want to know when my Harder Than Last Time supplements come out? What about the Seco Bar? Is that going to drop soon? And the answer is yes, it's already dropped. Use code Greg, 10% off. Click the link in description. HDLT subs, tons of supplements, creatine, protein powder, pre-workouts, stim, non-stim, G-stim, GO2 max, G-Wiz, so much I can't name them all. Please click the link in the description, visit my website, code Greg, 10% off everything. Also, if you want my training book, the cookbook, coaching plans by me and my team, the Circle Diet book, please click the link in the description, subscribe, click the bell button, comment for the algorithm, and until next time, I'm out.